it's the freelance mindset that I've never shaken off. It's being a founder of a company, you know, it's the responsibility you feel to your team. It's that your work is your passion, but the shadow of that is that you never really stop or know when to stop. You know, when you're really focused on an issue like climate, where the news can feel devastating, it's really kind of the floor beneath your feet kind of shakes. So I've had to learn to put down better boundaries to protect my time and create emotional distance. And ironically, I would also see activists burn out time and time again. And as I said, I really want to do this work for the rest of my life. And there's wisdom in it, right? If you have your eye on the long term rather than the short term, you pace yourself. And that's really, I think, that this chapter is much more about pacing myself.
From refugee camps to climate frontiers, photographer, filmmaker, NatGeo Explorer, and Earthrise Studio co-founder Alice Aedy has captured moving stories at the crossroads of people, politics, and planet. I've been inspired by Alice and her climate activism for many years, and so it is with great pleasure that I bring you this episode of The Slowdown, a podcast about redefining success and growth on your own terms. In a world addicted to speed and profitability, Alice represents a new kind of creativity and leadership. It's intentional, collaborative, and rooted in purpose. We talk about the personal cost of urgency, her creative process, and what being in the limelight has done for Alice, both good and bad. This episode is sponsored by Clue, the period and cycle tracking app, and I hope that you enjoy it. Hi, Alice.
Hi.
Welcome to The Slowdown. Thank you for being here. You are a documentary filmmaker, photographer, and co-founder of Earthrise Studio, a creative agency focused on climate and social justice storytelling. With a camera as your entry point into activism, you've traveled from refugee camps in Iraq, Lebanon, Greece, and Serbia to the front lines of climate change around the world, capturing stories that cut through apathy and ignite action. Your work has been featured in Vogue, The Guardian, The New York Times, and you've collaborated with organizations like the UN Refugee Agency and Extinction Rebellion. Your work, at least to me, asks not only what kind of world we're building, but how we live and work as change makers within it. Earlier this year, you became a NatGeo Explorer, which kind of feels like a unifier of a lot of your work. Can you explain what that is, for maybe to listeners who don't know, and what that means to you and for you?
So surreal to have your own past read out to you. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, for having me. So yeah, a few months ago, I was lucky to become a National Geographic Explorer, which basically means you join an amazing family sort of network of storytellers, scientists and conservationists who have been selected by National Geographic, and I applied for a grant to make a project with them. And so you get access to funding from National Geographic Society, which I had no idea are the biggest funders of independent storytelling on the planet. So I've since embarking on this journey, I've been to the Storytellers Summit and the Explorers Summit in DC at the National Geographic headquarters. And I've had the chance to see the kind of projects that they support. And it's, you know, it's what you might imagine. It's everything from a PhD student who's gone on to spend 20 years studying a rare species of frog in the Amazon, and National Geographic are supporting that person to spend, 367 days straight in the field documenting that species. It's the kind of projects and work that, honestly, if they weren't funding, I don't know who would. I am not going to be spending 367 days straight in the field, but I'm really excited to join, the storytellers who are photographers and filmmakers, everyone from Jane Goodall, Jimmy Chin, James Cameron, amazing storytellers who are using their craft to talk about people, planet, and nature. And what did it mean to me? It meant everything. It was a real honor, honestly. And people keep saying, wow, congrats. And I'm trying to not do the thing where I immediately downplay it, and I'm trying to sort of have my shoulders sit squarely and just thank them for the praise. But honestly, it just feels like the beginning of something. It feels like an initiation. It's less like they've opened a door, but they've sort of presented the door frame and said, hey, what are you going to do with this opportunity? I feel the fire in my belly, a bit of a kick up the arse, and I'm really excited to see how I can use this opportunity and what comes next.
And what did National Geographic mean for you growing up? Was that something you read what kind of space did it occupy in your imagination?
I still have, endless copies of that brilliant magazine framed by yellow. The magazine, and I guess I can chart certain films, and that's why I'm so passionate about storytelling, that really shaped my consciousness in those early years, like those tender years of 10, 11, 12, where I started to watch documentaries and read National Geographic. And I think it started to sort of give shape to what I wanted from my life, which was a life that meant something. And to me, a life of purpose meant somehow being in service. I don't think in those years I knew exactly how, but, ultimately I would find my way to studying politics, documenting the refugee crisis, and ultimately to telling climate stories, but really always with a focus on human stories, the power and the potential of human nature. I've traveled to a lot of places, climate frontlines, the front lines of conflict, or places where biodiversity is falling away. And I always kind of have never really lost my faith in our potential to do good. And I really hold that and carry it with me.
Well, you mentioned there the tender years of kind of 10, 11, 12. I'm always curious how people kind of began their lives and the genesis of things. So I'm wondering how you were raised, where and by whom, and how you think that has inferred who you are now.
I grew up in London. I was born in Belgium. I'm half Belgian mum and British dad. And in many ways I had like a very city upbringing, very privileged childhood. I went to private school, and I definitely remember those early teen years having a real sense of that, and I credit my parents with that. It was always, we endlessly talked about politics at the dinner table, so that we always had a very, very politically engaged family. And so I think I always had a sense of the world and my own positionality in it, and that drove me to make the choices that I did. I had a aunt who worked for the UN. My big brother would end up in international development, so there was always a sense of we have a lot, and could I live a life in service to people who didn't have as much? If I could have write, maybe I would have been a print journalist, but I always knew that I wanted to tell stories about politics visually. So my hero growing up was an amazing American photojournalist called Lindsay Addario, who had this remarkable story of dedicating her life to telling stories from, really her focus was on women and conflict areas. I read her biography when I was 17 or 18, and I just sort of devoured it and read every page and underlined it. And I thought, wow, I think this is what I want to do. So whether I was reading stories, reading National Geographic in those teen years, those very formative years, I was kind of creating a jigsaw puzzle kind of collage of what I wanted to do. And studying politics launched me down that path. But I think I really only found my calling when I picked up a camera, which was after uni, and started to teach myself to take photos and ultimately to start filming.
And I often ask, like, at what point did you kind of get examples of what success looked like? Like, as you were growing up and reading these stories, or at university, like, what was success modeled as for you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for me, people who are making impact are making a difference. I think I was always kind of relatively cynical about the value system that is so dominant, that tells us that success is just about money or career success. For me, it really was about trying to have an impact, however big that is. And I really feel that that is something that is missing for a lot of us if we don't find a sense of purpose and find a sense of being in service to something beyond ourselves. I think we can lack like a sense of anchoring, and I feel a lot of us feel that now. I've definitely had moments more recently where I'm trying to find my way, but I think having clarity on wanting to live a life in service and being in service to something beyond oneself gives me a sense of belonging. And that sense of belonging is a belonging to self, community, but also the planet. I see that thread between ourselves, each other, and the planet, and being in service to those has given me a sense of purpose and ultimately identity.
And you mentioned there that you discovered photography a bit kind of later. How did you discover photography, and how did that lead from picking up your first camera to actual like a photojournalism assignment?
I had two amazing teachers that really changed my life. One of them taught me history and politics at A-level, and the other taught me art. And it was a real like gamble between what I would go on to do at university. And in the end, I studied history and politics. But I was really passionate about the creative side, and I struggled at university, arriving and having to then ingest hundreds of pages of text and not having that creative outlet. When I left university, it was 2015, and it was the height of the refugee crisis. And because of my interest in photojournalism and the fact that, you know, throughout going to university in London, I would go to talks and events, and I was so curious. I love to learn, and I used every after uni day to go to talks and learn from people. And I was already going to places like, there's a journalism forum called the Frontline Club. And so it was always, even though I wasn't practicing journalism, I was already really interested, and I was studying people. And when I left in 2015 and the Syrian civil war was unfolding, there was a kind of European, you know, crisis on our doorstep, with millions of Syrians arriving on Greek shores and walking up at the beginning, up all the way into Germany. And so there were these very dramatic images of that migration route. It just felt impossible for me not to do something. It felt like inevitably I would need to do something. And I ended up heading out to Calais in northern France, initially as a volunteer. And because of my interest in journalism, I was really studying how different journalists were operating. And there was the sort of photojournalist with the long lens that was looking for action and tear gas. And then there were the journalists who were trying to tell compelling stories in depth, but only had 2 days on assignment. So I was really studying the different ways in which people were telling the stories. And I started to realize I had this space and time to dedicate. And I was really lucky to be able to do that. I was spent months in the field in the end. And for 4 years, I would document forced migration across Europe, following families, Iraq, Lebanon, and really was focused on it. But it was formative years for me to find the style with which I wanted to tell stories. And that was always with more time and more of a documentary approach rather than a kind of frontline breaking news stories. But it took me a while to work that out, and it took me a lot of studying and watching how different people were operating and how I wanted to do it myself. And I can see the through line from the beginning where, you know, I thought maybe I would do those shorter assignments, those breaking news stories, that ultimately I would find my way to documentary, in which there was more space, there was more nuance to tell more in-depth stories. But the absolute tipping point for me to start that work focused on the refugee crisis was seeing an image that really changed my life, really, if I look back at it, and fundamentally shifted the conversation around the refugee crisis, which was a photo of a young Syrian boy called Aylan Kurdi, who was drowned on Greek shores. And it was, the whole conversation changed from that point. And I think that was the moment I knew I wanted to do something. Became a volunteer and then started to take images of my own that would ultimately get published. And there are a few tipping points. One of my portraits of a young Syrian girl called Yamama was published on the front page of The Guardian, and it created the biggest fundraiser for child refugees in history. So I think at the beginning I was finding my feet, really studying how people were operating, and slowly but surely I found my confidence, how to approach people, how to build trust. These were all things I kind of learnt on the job and in the field. And I think I can now see that I was really driven by intuition and instinct, but at the time I really lacked confidence and felt like I was making up as I went along. And, you know, you got to imagine a really male-dominated industry. I was desperately trying to be taken seriously for those first years. Now I feel more I can more confidently say if people don't take me seriously, then, you know, I don't feel the need to kind of prove myself to them. But that was very, very difficult in those early years. I was terrified how to do the job properly, how to do right by the people that I was documenting, but also how do I carve my path in this industry of people much older and mostly men.
I mean, nobody is confident when they start something, right? Confidence comes later with experience and time. And now you might feel much more confident in those spaces, and you'll see the next people coming up and stuff, and feel that for them. Is there any particular place and experience that you had in those 4 years that stays in your memory?
It was a series of visits and really a deep friendship with one particular family, the Omar family, who I would meet and then return to over time. And I think that also taught me a lot to, as one of my mentors, Anastasia Taylor-Lind, amazing photojournalist, also a NatGeo Explorer, said, return to a story, return time and time again. And I think particularly now and already then, you know, with the pressure of Instagram, the pressure of creating content at such speed, moving on to the next story, you know, it'd be like you fly out, you do a week's assignment and the story is done. And I think I did that a lot, and I think I've learned from that, and in many ways still need to, but taking that piece of advice of returning to a story and the depth of that friendship and the depth of that relationship and watching them grow up is absolutely, you know, one of the most profound things that I take away from that period. I also had to learn a lot about how to create friendship, trust, but also boundaries with the people that I met. And at the beginning, I was sort of young, naive, sort of heart open, and really felt myself feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I really struggled to go between being in the field and going home and making sense of the duality of those experiences. And I had to learn to process in a different way, you know. And the camera's a funny thing, because when you're in the field, I'm so focused on the work and the job, you know, the technicalities of getting something in focus and framing it properly. It almost creates a kind of emotional distance, which is good and bad. It's good in the sense that, you know, we mustn't, as documentarians, take up space emotionally. I think in those moments, you're really there to hold space for the people who are generous enough to share their stories with you. But it also meant that I would find myself on the way home, often on, I can remember endless plane rides, like flicking through the photos and the work, and it was then that I would really process, or I wouldn't take the time to process. And after many months and ultimately years, I found myself continually getting quite burnt out, and needing to find better ways to manage that. How do you not become the stereotype of the war photographers and journalists that I had not only read about, but by that point met quite a few of, who are super jaded because they've been in incredibly challenging situations. They've seen a lot. And, you know, they're the cliche of sort of chain smoking, drinking too much, maybe because I haven't taken the time to process. So I knew I didn't want to be that. But how do you find that like tender balance between really showing up and not losing your humanity, but also knowing how to protect your energy and emotion?
The idea of the work itself creating a position of burnout, like, I understand how you were able to find methods to process the moments, but what about the work itself? Like, when the work built up and you were approaching kind of overwhelm or overwork, was there a point at which you realized, like, hey, this is too much for me?
I think it's taken me a long, long time to understand my own limitations and my own boundaries. And I am so passionate about the work that I do. It can often not feel like work. Yeah. And so I overextend my own boundaries. And, you know, I have for the past year been really committed to therapy, and I'd done periods of therapy in my life, but, you know, I'd cancel one every 3 or something. I just couldn't find the discipline to do it really, really properly. And for the past year I have been, and I will often mirror back to me that I can get on a call and just be like almost euphoric. I'm really excited. I'm sharing millions of different ideas of projects, and it can tend to be about work, and she'll stop me in my tracks and just say, hey, let's just slow down a second. Let's land in your body. Where are you? And I'll be like really surprised by her question, because I'm like, where am I? I'm euphoric. She says, yeah, you're all in the mind and not in the body. And it's taken me all these years to realize I can feel amazing, liberated, my most liberated self up here in the purely cerebral. You know, I'm a nerd. It's like I've been bouncing around up here without really landing in the body. And that can go on for so long until you do reach burnout. And I think there have been periods for me of exhaustion, of overworking, of burnout that I could almost think and push my way through. And then in the past, about a year ago, I really properly hit a burnout that was completely irrefutable, and my body and mind sort of stopped me in my tracks and told me to have a necessary collapse.
This season of The Slowdown is brought to you by Clue, the period and cycle tracking app that goes deeper than dates on a calendar. I talk a lot on this podcast about somatic wisdom and tuning into the signals from your body, and that really starts with understanding your cycle better. Clue is an essential part of my daily routine, not just knowing when my period is coming, but knowing what phase of my cycle I'm in, how I'm feeling, my energy, my sleep, and now I use it in the trying to conceive mode. If you've ever felt like your body was trying to tell you something but you weren't quite sure what, this is where Clue comes in. It's science-backed, inclusive, and totally ad-free, so that you can reclaim your rhythm one insight at a time. And especially for the Slowdown listeners, Clue is offering a 75% discount code on their annual Clue Plus subscription via their website. To redeem this, go to helloclue.com and enter the code SLOWDOWN at checkout. That's SLOWDOWN, one word. I'll also attach the direct link with the discount already embedded in the show notes. So download Clue today and start making space for the signals your body's been sending all along. A lot of people think you have burnout and suddenly the next day it's like, okay, here are all the changes I'm going to make to my life. And actually that's very rarely the case. It takes months and a lot of time to try and rewrite these habits and these ways of behaving. And as you say, it's very hard when it is something you're passionate about, not just for yourself, but for others and for the planet. And, one of the questions I always ask is this one about ambition and legacy versus like contentment and a feeling of enough. Like when you have this idea of, I want to achieve so much for the greater good, there is no end point to that, really. So are you able to balance this idea of legacy, ambition, purpose, all the stuff that you want to do with a feeling of like, it's enough for today?
Yeah, and so to go back a step, I hilariously, when I did hit the burnout that I knew I couldn't look away from, I took an equally sort of productivity-based approach to healing. So I was like, okay, there's going to be a linear relationship between hours of therapy, hours of rest put into, I'd gone through a separation of my partner of 9 years. There was heartbreak. There was massive changes that I had to face with the business that I run, letting go of teams. So there was a few things that were wrapped up in accepting how burnt out I was. One of the reasons I sort of pushed it away for so long and kept running so hard was because I knew there was going to be I would have to face enormous consequences and big changes if I really, put myself first and said, hey, I can no longer be running this fast. What the past year has taught me is that none of these things are linear, and that really it's very, very cyclical. So there are weeks and months that I feel, amazing, back to normal, even better. And then I'll have unexpected dips. So my perception of time has fundamentally changed this year. And I've gone from, if you'd asked me on one day to the next, how are you doing? I would have been like, I'm good. Not really knowing the difference. And now every day, every week sort of feels like much more expansive in a way, but also more unpredictable, because I think I am more embodied, I hope, and more in touch with how I'm feeling. When it comes to, I love the frame that you use, ambition and legacy versus contentment and a feeling of enough. I think I'm still working on that. When you are faced with your own limitations and gone on the journey that I have, I've done an unbelievable amount of introspection and asking myself questions around why I would have been so driven by ambition and legacy. And I think I'm massively, I hope, loosening my grip on the idea of legacy, success, and what I'm running towards. And I think I held on to it much more tightly before.
On the chronology of your life, tell me the story of how you ended up from photojournalism and starting documentaries to founding Earthrise.
So given my focused on forced migration, kind of the more stories I was telling, the more time passed, the more I realized climate change was going to exacerbate some of those issues that I'd been documenting. So we know that climate change is going to create the biggest mass migration of people, redrawing world maps. We were seeing that in real time in the UK, how already immigration was taking up a disproportionate space in the sort of political debate. Today, it's very much the same. I kind of came to climate storytelling understanding that it would make the things that I cared about much worse, that it was going to fundamentally shape society and not just biodiversity and nature. So I was very passionate about the human storytelling and the people that I most admired. So David Attenborough, you know, had made us fall in love with nature, but often there weren't human stories. And so this notion, this frame of what we now call climate justice, how climate change is a social justice issue, became a real focus for me. And that was one of the foundations of starting Earthrise, to tell those human stories and to try and do it in an optimistic way, that not everything was lost. I had started to travel to climate frontlines, to Somaliland, to Kiribati, an island in the South Pacific, where it's just 2 meters above sea level. So meeting people who are experiencing this in real time, and then returning home, joining movements that were beginning, like Extinction Rebellion, sort of not knowing what to do. It felt like the stories I was telling and getting published weren't doing enough and weren't creating impact. You know, by this point, I'd spent a few years, I guess I could say I was part of the media industry at this point, but I felt that I wanted to take it a step further and really think more strategically about the creative and the impact of that work. And so out of fear, but also, I guess, just understanding the role that I wanted to play in the movement to serve this issue, we started Earthrise, and it was to tell better stories around climate. This was the middle of the pandemic. Everyone was on their phones. I couldn't pick up my camera bag and travel to where the story was, which is what I would have done. And we could see that young people were getting their news online and getting educated. We were using, you know, social media and design to educate, and that was really the foundation of Earthrise, the company at the beginning, was to educate young people around climate. From that point, we started to make digital content series, documentaries. You know, we're lucky to work with Sir David Attenborough and Jane Goodall on a series called Seat at the Table. We started traveling to the UN climate conferences to sort of report from there and really focus on climate justice, Indigenous rights, and the fossil fuel industry. In those early years, the UK government, massive credit to Extinction Rebellion, announced a climate emergency. Since then, Earthrise has made a massive breadth of work, from the super, super short form to now feature documentaries, but always with the aim of trying to shift policy in some way, drive empathy, because you can't protect what you don't love. And we've experimented with lots of ways of doing that. And amazing campaigns like the Yasuni campaign in Ecuador, which has stopped oil drilling in a national park there, stopping the building of the Rosebank oil field. Last year, we worked with Spotify on a campaign to make nature officially an artist on all streaming platforms, which was a really fun one. And like, more for me, the impact that I want to have is to get people to connect with nature and see that humans are a part of nature and not separate from it, which I think is really at the root of the crisis, is that we don't see ourselves as part of the natural world. The disconnection is so insidious. It's kind of, if I think about the single story that I focused on these past few years of reframing or overturning, is this idea of the separation, because from that, I think the climate crisis is a symptom.
The impact piece is interesting, because I think being a journalist, being in the media, you're just writing stories and you're focusing on that element of it. It's just write the piece, get the piece to the editor, have it printed. Whereas what you're doing now is a much more cohesive, like actually looking, as you say, at the whole campaign of the project. Where does it come in? Where does it come out? What are the goals of this project? How can we tangibly measure those goals? Which I think is very different to just writing an article. If we take that Spotify example, because I think it's such a nice one, what was the kind of brief or the initial idea? How did that creative process work for you to create what you ended up creating? And what were the kind of tangible measures that you could see as the kind of things that showed you that it had impact?
We joined the most incredible coalition of I think it was 27 partners, but way more beyond that. The idea initially came from an amazing group called Museum for the UN, Earth%, an amazing organisation that are trying to channel music funds into nature conservation. Lots of different groups that came together in a coalition with initially Spotify, and then the campaign would spread to other streaming platforms. But essentially the idea was to create a really easy, tangible way just to become a fan of nature and fuel the funds with every stream, every play of a song that was on the nature playlist, to fund nature's conservation. So much climate action has involved sacrifice, and this was a very hopeful, simple, hopefully inspiring way to both get money to fund nature's conservation, but also reframe the way that we think about nature. And so there was brilliant thinking and development around, nature as the original musician, a star born 4.6 billion years ago and never credited for her work, our ultimate muse, our ultimate inspiration. So both making it practically very easy for the audience and the consumer to take action in this case, but
which
also
was just listen to these songs.
Yeah, listen and
simple.
play, and a percentage of the royalties would then fund organizations. Artists then collaborated with nature sounds, and that was also part of the fun, I think, and the brilliance of the campaign, as you had Ellie Goulding and Brian Eno remixing tracks or making tracks with nature sounds. It had a huge amount of coverage, but it's also just the beginning, and that was amazing to work on a campaign that's also going to have a long, how it is, like campaigns can sometimes be very flash in the pan, so hopefully that's going to really have an enduring legacy.
I love that. It was such a great campaign. You mentioned earlier how you just pick up a camera bag and that would be you off for a project. It's really the definition of a freelancer going out into the world. And so I'm wondering, with Earthrise in the future, and I know you've been executive producer on now a number of films, is that somewhere that you see allowing you to support more projects, do things beyond yourself and like your time? This is a space where you can create things with teams where you do what you do best, but then it can create a bigger project?
Yeah, I mean, starting Earthrise completely changed my life. I went from being the person behind camera in the field to now growing a team in London. And I think it was a really beautiful discovery for me to realize how much I loved collaborating. And in a way, journalism, there were moments of collaboration, but particularly as a photojournalist, it was a pretty lonely exercise. What I loved about starting to work in documentary film and then building a team was that you collaborate with people way better, smarter, more experienced and brilliant than you. And I loved that. And I think I learned about myself that I like working across multiple projects, bringing those teams together. I always had a connection to the story. I think I was always passionate about building trust with the protagonist, but now I had the chance to kind of slightly sit outside and work across multiple projects and spin multiple plates. There were massive challenges with growing and running a team. Like, I wore that responsibility very heavily on my shoulders, how to be a good leader and how to establish a good work culture, and all these questions became a big part of my life. I have definitely more recently been trying to find better balance where I can also protect my own time and nurture my own creativity, and hopefully National Geographic opportunity can be part of that. But no doubt the learnings that came from the superpower of working as a team just gave me so much energy, and I think I really thrived in. And not every film, I always lament that like directors get so much credit on the stage at the Oscars and things, because it's such a collective exercise, and every film is an amazing team effort, and so many people are part of it that don't get credit.
Another thing that I guess is a bit of a solo endeavor is the fact that over the course of these years and like telling these stories and building these platforms, you end up with quite a large social following, and you end up a little in the limelight, and great things can come from that, from shining a light on important causes, building a name for yourself in the industry, networking, getting asked to speak, host, even attend amazing things. But there is like a shadow side to having such a spotlight on you. being an influencer often means people don't just know about your work, they know about your personal life. And as you said, you worked very closely with your partner. How do you deal with those two sides of the same coin of these social platforms?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that I think I'm really quite private. So I've struggled to know how to navigate it. Definitely in the beginning, I remember on social, I thought I will never post a photo of myself on social. It will always be about the work and the people that I meet. And of course, the nature of social media just radically changed since those early years.
And the fact is that people respond better to a photo of you, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Like, even if it's the first photo in a carousel or you're somewhere in it, people just respond. That's the nature of the social media.
I mean, now more than ever, I feel that is so explicit. But even in those early years of sharing work, I started to realize, okay, if people feel invested in you, they'll feel invested in the things that you feel that you care about. And a lot of the work that I've been doing is trying to take people on the journey with me. Why do I care? Why is this important? Why should you care? So I definitely started to use my own voice and myself as a tool to do that. I was terrified of public speaking. I hated being in the limelight at the beginning. I really didn't have the confidence. I much prefer to be in your position, asking the questions and being the vehicle and bringing out the best in the other person. I really, even when I'm on stage, I'd much prefer to host than I would to be interviewed, because I think ultimately I don't feel that comfortable with the limelight being on me. And as a storyteller, I like being the bridge to other people. So finding that balance is a work in progress. I think I've struggled to be genuinely vulnerable on social media. You're held to a very high standard, especially if you're talking about social justice issues, and particularly in the climate space. It's brutal. And I think every social movement, we waste a lot of energy sort of pointing fingers at each other, and that, you know, I think I think I'm still trying to work out how to best use social to, you know, I've definitely used it as a place to share my work. I think I'd like to find a way to share really honestly and be more vulnerable. But it's quite scary to me, actually. And I'm always trying to find the right balance and look to the people that I really admire who have these amazing long careers and really playing a long game. So I think they balance the private with the public pretty well, but no doubt it's the most incredible tool. I feel really lucky to have an audience that I can communicate to directly. And I'm always, when I get to meet people in person, I'm like, fucking hell, you're so brilliant and so intelligent and informed. And, you know, the Earthrise audience feels like they know more about climate than me. So, I think it's a balancing act. I did, you know, very publicly ran the company with my ex-partner, and we spoke a lot and shared a lot about our relationship. Weirdly, I wasn't sort of that aware until the relationship ended, that people had kind of kind of idealized the relationship in a way. And of course, when you're in it, it's so real and it's so human, it's so flawed. And you don't share publicly the struggles. I mean, you know, we all know social media is a kind of highlights reel. So I think when the relationship ended and seeing people's surprise and genuine shock, you know, be they mainly friends, I kind of began to realize, oh, maybe I had been part of crafting and curating a very idealized image that people had then began to believe in. I didn't talk about the separation for many months, you know, but neither of us did. And then we found the right time to do that together. So there was like real intention behind holding it all quite privately and then sharing when it ended.
But yeah, I guess people then feel a level of like, if you do share, they feel sort of entitled to know. And this kind of personal boundaries get crossed, especially if you both have large followings. It's like people feel like you owe them this information or something. And, you know, we were talking about slowing down and the kind of dichotomy of these two spaces of ambition versus content and stuff. And working in climate activism specifically, I've spoken to a lot of people who struggle with, well, when do I stop when there's a problem that is raging, and the burnout that is caused and the conflict that is caused in working so hard to fix something, feeling futile in fixing that thing, feeling like you can't stop because the thing is still a problem. I'm wondering how you kind of draw the line and know when to say, okay, I've done kind of what I can do and I need to take a 2-week holiday.
I have only really started protecting my time off. I just got back from 2 weeks away, and it was one of the first times that I genuinely was offline and protecting that space. And it's the freelance mindset that I've never shaken off. It's being a founder of a company, it's the responsibility you feel to your team. It's that your work is your passion, but the shadow of that is that you never really stop or know when to stop. And this sort of low level of anxiety that comes from, I would describe it as you're building a bridge that feels like it's collapsing at the other end. When you're really focused on an issue like climate, where the news can feel devastating, it's really kind of the floor beneath your feet kind of shakes. So I think over time I've had to, like I did in the beginning of my career, had to find the way to put emotional distance between me and the issue. I've learned that the hard way in this next chapter of being focused on climate. I've had to learn to put down better boundaries to protect my time and create emotional distance. And, I'm sure, having spoken to people on climate, there are these amazing conversations now happening around rest and joy, because it can feel so desperately terrifying and depressing ultimately. And so weaving that into your everyday is actually like an active part of my world now, and taking better care of myself. Because ironically, I would also see activists burn out time and time again. And as I said, I really want to do this work for the rest of my life. And there's wisdom in it, right? If you have your eye on the long term rather than the short term, you pace yourself. And that's really, I think, that this chapter is much more about pacing myself. And I've had moments, the past couple of months were really, really busy before I went away. And I was like, oof, I finally kind of had emerged from a feeling of burnout. And I felt exhilarated because I was like, oh, here's this creative energy back, and wow, where have you been? I haven't felt you for a while. And so I found myself pushing really, really hard and being back in that mode of not knowing my own limitations. And so I think it's a practice of constantly reeling yourself back and observing it and taking the time to rest. And so I haven't found all the answers, but definitely being much more intentional about slowing down.
What are your kind of top tips for slowing down in your day-to-day micro?
Okay, one would be, ironically, I often take myself to the future to look back at that present moment. So how will future me look back at this moment? Will it be that big a deal? Have you actually navigated a million moments like this? Does the emotion that you're feeling feel strong now? Does it feel really urgent? And actually, how many times has a moment like this or an emotion like this come and gone? So the feeling of recognizing this too shall pass, whatever emotion, a sense of perspective. Yeah. Like, can I put this into perspective? Number 2, for me, knowing how much I can exist in the cerebral and in the mind, it is having a daily practice to get into my body. That looks like exercise, it looks like running, it can look like yoga, it can look like boxing. I think I'm not prescriptive about what it is, but it's the practicing coming back into the body, because I will try every which way to kind of get out of there.
We mentioned earlier cycles and seasons and working with your body, and I'm curious, how aware are you of your cycle during the month?
It's so funny that you asked this, because I just during this time away have been talking a lot with friends about the notion that it feels that this last chapter of feminism, let's say, told us that to be equal to men, we needed to be the same as them. And that's been an illusion, and I think has led us to feel that we can have it all, when actually that's just absolutely not the case. And we're burning ourselves out, women disproportionately having autoimmune diseases, because we're trying to have it all, be well exercised, have kids, have a career, etc. And I think we started to talk about our cycles much more, and that's one of the ways. And hormones, we have a much more complex combination and variations of hormone levels than men. Like, someone described it to me as men have basically 2 settings, women have up to 14. We are fundamentally different from men, and as to your point, can we lean into it and that become a superpower? I am very aware in which the ways in which being in my cycle, the 10 days leading up, I'm exhausted and cannot function in the same way. I have not done enough of understanding how it can like nurture my creativity. So that's something I really would love to understand more about, and I think is just fundamentally important for us to be more connected. But how have you found it?
It's also very new on the exploration list because, like you, it was not something that was discussed. My 20s were just like, capitalism says you should work every day at the same pace and rhythm. Productivity books written by men say that you should be up at 5 and doing this and doing that. And so it doesn't account for the female body at all. I was also on the pill for a long time growing up. And so that was very much like, what hormones, what changes, you know? Yeah. And so really understanding myself better has been interesting, having compassion for myself. You know, I'd never, ever, ever in 20 years would I ever say to anyone, be it a colleague, like, oh, I'm like PMSing today, or I'm like, I'm in pain today, so like I'm gonna struggle. That to me was like weakness. You don't let people know that. They'll just be like, roll their eyes or whatever, like, oh, another woman like complaining about her period was very much the terminology. This episode and podcast is sponsored by Clue, which is a period and cycle tracking app, and I found it to be really helpful to kind of get an understanding through data and knowledge and time. Oh, like these days that I'm far more argumentative with my partner fall into, you know, a really particular set of days for me. And I think that's like helpful data and knowledge to be able to go to that person, be it a partner, be it a doctor, whatever it might be, and say, here's something I've been tracking. Because women are called crazy and hysterical. And so I think to be able to have the data to say, actually, for a year now, in my luteal phase or whatever it might be, like this is happening for me, is empowering.
I did try at work at Earthrise with a team to normalize speaking about it. So if I was feeling really exhausted on the first day of my period or had PMS, like anecdotally would try and do it. And, you know, it definitely made some of the men feel a bit uncomfortable, but bit by bit, I think it eased things. I think there's a lot more I could have done in terms of menstrual leave, and I'll be interested to see how this like shapes policy moving forward. All knowledge is power, and self-knowledge is no doubt as a superpower. I don't think I have really been that attached to it, which feels incongruent with how hard I work, and there's no doubt, you know, it would be really naive and dishonest for me to say I'm not driven by success and ambition and all the things that we've spoken about. I'm more driven by expectations I set for myself than others. And so it is an honor, you know, when I got Forbes 30 under 30, that was amazing, but I didn't feel that attached to it. Mainly I was excited that it was, you know, in the impact category. So I think I have a healthy relationship with accolades, and it can only get healthier, which is less and less, because as you say, I think this next chapter for me, I would rather be about contentment and a sense of feeling enough than just ambition and other people's version of success. I feel like we're having a massive consciousness shift as a society, as we hear more conversations about people we perceive to have it all and be at the top of their game, top of their field, the most successful people on the planet, saying, hey, I've reached the top of the mountain and I'm not happy either. And guess what? There's a gaping hole in my sense of self, and that's what's driving me. I think my curiosity about people and just my interest in psychology and the work that I've been trying to do on myself, I'm realizing I'm more interested in understanding the things that are driving me to success than having the accolades to reflect that success.
What is your current working definition of success?
Well, I think success for me is balance, and that is absolutely not what it would have been before. When I thought about success before, it was less about awards and accolades, but it was certainly driving forward with a pace towards an abstract sense of impact and making a difference, and being in service. But in a way, my own health and taking care of myself was never part of the equation. I think now success looks like much better balance between work, life. I really hope that I am a better sister, friend, that I have been in the past, because work was my absolute priority. So yeah, my sense of identity has been really attached to work, and I hope that it's more balanced with different parts of my life now.
And then I have to ask, because you've met some incredible people throughout your career, you know, already name dropped David Attenborough, Jane Goodall. What comes to mind to you as like a really memorable meeting with somebody, and why? I'll
never forget an interview with Jane Goodall just before the interview, she kind of often wears these like shawls, and a little bottle of whiskey emerged from behind this shawl, and she just took the most tiniest sip to clear her throat, and then she was ready to begin. And apparently this is just the thing, that she needs what they call apple juice to clear her throat before interviews. I think interviewing what I would call these kind of wisdom holders, especially that, you know, our elders, let's say, are my most memorable, because to me there's something that unifies all these voices and these people, is that actually the ego is pretty much absent. Like, they are vessels, they are messengers, and the message is coming almost through their body. And I really, really admire that. There's like a humility in some of those leaders that I aspire to have, aspire to be, and they leave their ego at the door. And I think that is good leadership, and it's longevity. There's a reason that the Jane Goodalls, the Sylvia Earles, the David Attenboroughs continue to work and be respected in the way that they do. I think they bring people from different sides of the political aisle to the same table. They have had the tenacity, the resilience to continue showing up, and they've played the long game, you know. And I realize I said that a few times today, and I guess that increasingly is part of my definition of success, actually, is to not need to be successful quickly. It's to continue to show up, maybe in a slower but more intentional way.
This like longevity towards purpose is really interesting, because I think, we're taught like get there as fast as you can, but then what when you're at the top of the mountain, as you said. The last question I ask everybody is, if I had to watch one film or read one book or look at one piece of art, so some cultural manifestation, to help understand you better, so to help me understand you better, what would it be and why?
My recommendation would be to watch a documentary called The Salt of the Earth, which is a film that charts the life of Sebastião Salgado, who's a Brazilian photojournalist who we recently lost just a few weeks ago. And he dedicated his life to indigenous stories in Brazil, to mining and sort of modern day slavery, and ultimately to a project that spanned, I think, 8-9 years, called Genesis, which was around the environment. The film is an unbelievable tribute to his life. It's made by Wim Wenders and his son Juliano Salgado, who I'm now lucky to be working with. But it shows the humanity of his work, and then ultimately how telling those stories took a toll on him, and that he found a way to fall in love back with the world and back with the earth by starting this huge regenerative project in Brazil, where he's famously rewilding, I don't know the exact number, but hundreds of thousands of acres of land from totally... You've seen, So there's a meme that always kind of goes viral of him and Lelia, his amazing wife, who pioneered this project. And through seeing this land come back to life, he found, I think, his life force again. And I find his work and legacy really inspiring.
Yeah, I see the parallels of the pacing yourself and coming back to stories again and again. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. This episode was hosted and created by me, Tiana Tambridge. It was produced by Whitney Rosenthal, with sound and video produced and recorded at Brazen Studios. Cover art and design by Natalia Ruhe, and the sponsor for this whole season is Clue. Please subscribe to The Slowdown to be notified of upcoming episodes, tell a friend, and leave a review, because it really helps a podcast like this get out there into the world. And remember, we're all heading to the same destination, and there is no prize for getting there early, so we might as well slow down.